first Greek civilizations. The objectives are, 1, describe the Mycenaean civilization, and 2, characterize the role models used in the Iliad and Odyssey, which the Greeks used to present values of courage, honor, and excellence. Now, we'll begin, as we've begun in all various regions throughout the world, with the impact of geography. Now, geography, as we've seen in Mesopotamia or in China or in Egypt, have always set the destiny or trajectory of a specific civilization in the region. So when we begin to talk about Greek geography, we're not specifically talking about the people groups that live there, the Greek-speaking peoples, because they're not around at this early stage. But when we talk about Greece, we're talking about the region that we know of today as Greece and what the geography looks like. Now, Greece occupies a small area with a mountainous peninsula and numerous islands. They're all over the place. They're separate and disparate. The different chains and cities that develop in valleys separate from others allows for a civilization that is really disparate and broken apart. They're not unified. We're not going to see major empires or major kingdoms arise like we'll see in other places. The mountains and the sea played especially significant roles in the development of Greek history. So it reinforced these separate identities of the regions. While there are, of course, still small plains and river valleys like we've seen everywhere else, the disparate nature of the geography allowed for different communities to arise in different regions, and these people groups were disconnected in a certain sense from each other. So the rivalry that arises from this discontinuity between one another, between the communities that kind of crop up, lead to warfare that devastated Greek society in the long run, because there was no massive unity like we see in other places. Now, Greece has a long seacoast dotted by bays and inlets that provided many harbors, and so naturally the Greek people, the people who settle in this region, will become seafaring peoples. Now, there are 3 major bodies of water that we see in this region that have a huge impact: the Aegean Sea, the Mediterranean, and the Black Sea to the northeast. Now, these regions, of course, reinforce the disconnectedness of these Greek peoples, but also necessitated a sort of interconnecting web of cultural traditions and trade networks that creates an interesting network in the trajectory of Greek society. Now, the first civilization that arose within this region are not necessarily Greek in a true sense. The Minoan civilization is where all discussion of Greek society begins. Now, somewhere around 2800 BCE, there were a Bronze Age civilization that emerged on the island of Crete, most specifically. Now, we call them the Minoan civilization, which flourished somewhere around 2700 BCE to 1450 BCE roughly. Now, the archaeologist Arthur Evans named these people the Minoan civilization after the legendary king Minos. Now, there's a lot of mythology and tradition that surrounds this island and surrounds this king, who famously is most known for the Minotaur, Minoan Island. So you can kind of see the connection there. Now, what went on historically rather than in the mythos is that they seemed to have been a massive economic empire dominating the middle Mediterranean. Now, they had enormous and complex structures, particularly in their main capital, so we guess at Knossos. We can guess from their wealth and from pottery shards that connect the various regions that the ships of the Minoans took them to Egypt and to southern Greece, and because of the geography, they seemed to be a middleman between the two major empires and regions. So they were sort of like a broker in the ancient world, a middleman, a middle space, where people would go and meet and trade and exchange goods, which made them, of course, very wealthy, and the whole trade and ordeal was quite lucrative. Now here you can see the satellite image of the island of Crete. many spaces and places in which harbors and cities could be built. Now, the center of Minoan civilization really suffered a dramatic, catastrophic collapse somewhere around 1450 BCE. Now, most historians have argued back and forth on what this might have been. What caused such a catastrophic collapse all at once? Now, some people have proposed tidal waves or tidal waves triggered by volcanic eruptions, all sorts of different things. But most historians agree today that the destruction occurred as a result of mainland Greeks, that is, people who conquered the region, known as Mycenaeans. Now, these Mycenaeans and the Mycenaean invasion seems to have caused the collapse and the political collapse and the economic collapse of the Minoans. Now, the Mycenae were a kind of mythic people. Again, this is very mythic and mythos. The term Mycenaean comes from the Mycenae, which is connected to the battle and epics of Troy and the Iliad. And the archaeologist Heinrich Schliemann believed that the people that he had discovered archaeologically were the same that were in the Iliad. Agamemnon, the king of the Mycenaeans. Now, the civilization seems to have been part of the massive Indo-European nomad group, which we've seen before, that have conquered India, crossing the Middle East. Now, the Indo-Europeans, in general, were characterized by similar traits that the Mycenaeans were. That is, iron use, chariots, things like that, a militaristic tradition. And so they seem linguistically and traditionally to be part of that same network, that same group of nomads. Now, the Mycenaeans specifically flourished between 1600 and 1100 BCE. Now, they created various centers of power in which they formed loose alliances. This isn't a monolithic monarchy or something like that. These are groups of people migrating into a region, setting up principalities and power groups and power centers, and creating loose alliances with one another. Now, among the most notable features of the Mycenaean centers were the tombs, where members of the royal families were buried, which is a kind of an important note because the Mycenaeans themselves buried their dead, a tradition that the Greeks that will invade later did not hold. In fact, they'll burn the bodies of the dead. So we see that there's a different cultural tradition that existed between these people. In fact, in one of these burials, Schliemann uncovered a great deal of wealth, gold and golden masks and beautiful things. And, of course, while Schliemann is criticized for his archaeological techniques, much more like Indiana Jones than in any kind of scientific approach today, however, he did uncover a great deal of beautiful things connected to this Mycenaean civilization. Now, the Mycenaeans, as we gather, were a warrior people who prided themselves on their heroic deed. The kinds of heroes and people they lauded were very important militaristic warrior-type people. The Mycenaean monarchies developed along these various regions and established extensive commercial network trades. We see this through pottery shards and pottery pieces that are all over the region that kind of give us a hint on the Mycenaean trade network. Now, the military conquest of Crete and other Aegean islands is also attested both in later mythic history and telling of the Mycenaeans, but also through the pottery network. Now, the most famous, of course, when we talk about the Mycenaeans is the description that Homer provides in the famous literary epic poems of the Iliad and the Odyssey. Now, we'll return to those later, but the important point here is that they describe a king, Agamemnon, who's the king of the Mycenae, and sacked the city of Troy. Now, what's important here is the kind of ideal of the warrior king and the warrior people of the Mycenae. Now, the Mycenaean states fought one another, of course, but also were conquered to some extent by waves of Greek-speaking invaders that will truly be speaking the kind of Greek that will emerge later as truly Greek. And they will kind of emerge from the north in somewhere around 1100 BCE as the Mycenaeans kind of melt away politically. Now, before that, of course, here we see the Mycenaean civilization at its height in this infograph on the kind of trade network that existed. The trade network there interconnected mainland Greece with Anatolia, the Black Sea to some extent, all the way down to Egypt and Africa, to the Palestinian region. So they took over this massive trade network. Now, remember, the evidence here that we see are pottery shards and interconnected resources. Now, what emerged after the Mycenaean collapse is known as the Greek Dark Age. Now, historians call this period the Dark Age, somewhere around 1100 to 750 BCE, because of the scant records. The fact that there are very little records is actually why we call it a Dark Age. Not because necessarily the people were evil or things were sub-civilized or something, but that there's just very little, certainly not written records and very few archaeological records. There are no major civilizations or cities built at this time. Now, a large numbers of Greeks left at this time, at least, the mainland and sailed across the Aegean Sea and settled various islands. Particularly the most notable here is the settling of Asia Minor along the coast, what is called Ionia, the Ionian coast, which is very important for later on. But what we see is that the Greeks, in a true sense, spread out from that region in absorbing and kind of collecting the Mycenaean tradition, of course, but also integrating it into themselves. But they are a different ethnic group. Now, there is a revival of trade and economic activity at the close of this time in this region. Iron had replaced bronze, which of course is cheaper and occurs all over the place and allows for the construction of more powerful weapons. But in the 8th century, one of the most important developments occurs in Greece. That is the adoption of the Phoenician alphabet. The Greeks adopt the Phoenician phonetic system in which sounds emerge. Here it is morphed into what might be seen as a more classical Greek language written in a phonetic language. Now, what's most important here, though, is when we talk about going into this classical period, the impact that the Mycenaean civilization has on the trajectory of future Greek society. The Iliad and the Odyssey, two massive epic poems by Homer, really capture and categorize the Mycenaean value system. They served as examples of courage and honor. That Homer's characterization of these people, their characters, are models of heroism and honor. And yes, this is Mycenaean, but to some extent this becomes the set standard for the future Greek civilization. That is, the young men and women will look at the figures most famous in these stories of Achilles and Odysseus, and how one should behave and how one should act. I mean, you might compare this to the tradition of the biblical narrative in modern Western society, when people have pointed to figures like Jesus or whoever else in these narratives and said one must act like this. And this is similar in that sense, that the great heroes that Homer describes are people that are to be looked up to and modeled their lives after. Now, to remind you, the objectives then were, 1, describe the Mycenaean civilization. That is, those Mycenaean migratory groups, the Indo-Europeans, that came down into the region and kind of took over the Aegean network. And 2nd, characterize the role models used in the Iliad and the Odyssey, which the Greeks used to present values of courage, honor, and excellence, really setting the Mycenaean value system as a rubric or marker for future Greek civilization.